My grandmother Celeste told me this story on her deathbed, and I didn't believe a single word of it until I found the medal hidden in her jewelry box 3 days later. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Picture this, your sweet, quiet grandmother who spent 40 years working at the local library, who made the best apple pie in 3 counties, who never raised her voice above a whisper, suddenly grabs your hand with surprising strength and tells you she once destroyed 3 Nazi tanks before breakfast. You'd think the morphine was talking too, right? That was me 3 months ago, sitting beside her hospital bed, nodding politely while she spun what I thought was the most elaborate fantasy I'd ever heard. Celeste had always been the gentle one in our family. She collected porcelain dolls, grew prize-winning roses, and her biggest act of rebellion was switching to decaf coffee after her doctor said regular was too strong for her heart. But then she started talking about radio frequencies and German tank formations, and the exact sound a Panzer makes when it hits a landmine. The details were so precise, so technical, that I started taking notes just to humor her. She described the weight of mining explosives, the smell of cordite in underground tunnels, the way her hands shook as she connected detonator wires by candlelight. "Maya," she whispered, gripping my fingers with hands that suddenly felt like they'd done more than arrange library books. People always assumed I was nobody special. Even I believed it for most of my life. But on May 16th, 1944, I learned that sometimes the most ordinary person becomes extraordinary when everyone they love is about to die. I patted her hand and promised I'd remember her story, thinking I was just being kind to a dying woman's final wishes. Then she closed her eyes and said something that made my blood freeze. "Check my jewelry box when you clean out the house. 3rd drawer, false bottom." You'll understand then. Celeste passed away that night. 3 days later, while sorting through her belongings, I found exactly what she said I would. Wrapped in tissue paper, hidden beneath a layer I almost missed, was a tarnished bronze medal with a ribbon in French colors. The inscription read, "Croix de guerre, Celeste Novak, for extraordinary valor in the destruction of enemy armor, May 1944. My quiet grandmother, the woman who apologized for taking up space in grocery store lines, had been a decorated war hero for 78 years and never told a soul." That's when I realized every word she'd told me was true. The sweet librarian who raised me had once been a 19-year-old girl who saved an entire French village using nothing but radio equipment, mining explosives, and the kind of courage I never knew she possessed. This is her story. This is the story of how Celeste Novak went from being just a radio operator to the most unlikely tank destroyer in World War II history. To understand how my grandmother became a tank destroyer, you need to know who she was before that night changed everything. In 1944, Celeste Novak was 19 years old, living in a village called Saint-Pierre-du-Mont, just 30 miles from the German border. She was the youngest of 4 children, and by far the quietest. Her family had run the same small farm for 3 generations, but the war had stripped away almost everything they owned. Her father, Henri, was a gentleman who fixed clocks and watches to supplement their meager income from crops the Germans hadn't seized. Her mother, Vivienne, took in sewing from neighboring villages, working by candlelight because fuel for lamps was too precious to waste on anything but emergencies. The war had already taken its toll on their family. Celeste's older brother Thomas had been captured during a resistance operation 6 months earlier. Nobody knew if he was dead or alive, but Henri aged 10 years in those 6 months, and Vivienne stopped singing the old French folk songs she used to hum while she worked. That left Celeste and her 2 middle siblings, but they'd both fled to Lyon when the German presence grew heavier. Celeste refused to leave. She couldn't abandon her parents, and honestly, she didn't think she was brave enough to make it on her own in a big city where survival meant constant vigilance and quick thinking. But Celeste had one skill that made her invaluable to the local resistance cell. Before the war, she'd helped her father repair the intricate mechanisms inside clocks and radios. Her hands never shook no matter how delicate the work, and she had an intuitive understanding of how electrical circuits functioned. When the resistance acquired new radio equipment from a British airdrop, they needed someone who could operate the complex frequency systems without formal training. "Your daughter has steady hands and a sharp mind," Laurent Dubois had told her parents when he approached them about recruiting Celeste. Laurent was the local resistance coordinator, a former mathematics teacher who'd lost his wife and son in a German bombing raid. We need someone who can stay calm under pressure and follow precise technical instructions. Henri had wanted to refuse immediately, but Vivienne understood what Laurent wasn't saying directly. The resistance needed radio operators because their previous ones had been caught and executed. It was dangerous work, but someone had to do it, and Celeste was uniquely qualified. For 8 months, Celeste had spent her nights in the cellar beneath Margot's bakery, operating radio equipment that connected resistance cells across the region with Allied intelligence networks. The cellar was cramped, cold, and constantly damp. She worked by the light of a single candle, copying coded messages, relaying troop movements, and coordinating supply drops. Margot, the baker, was a widow in her 50s who joined the resistance after her husband was killed in the early days of the occupation. She provided perfect cover for Celeste's activities because German soldiers frequently bought bread from her shop, never suspecting that crucial intelligence was being transmitted from directly beneath their feet. Every night, Celeste would slip through the back door of the bakery after the German patrol passed at 11 o'clock. She'd settle into the cellar with her radio equipment, headphones, and coded message books. Her job was simple in theory: receive messages from other resistance cells, decode them using preset cipher keys, then transmit the information to Allied command stations in England. But simple didn't mean easy. One wrong frequency setting could result in German operators intercepting their transmissions. One poorly coded message could expose entire resistance networks. One transmission lasting too long could allow German direction-finding equipment to pinpoint their location. The work required absolute precision and nerves of steel, but Celeste never felt heroic doing it. She saw herself as just a messenger, a human telegraph machine who happened to have the technical skills needed to operate complex radio equipment. The real heroes in her mind were people like Laurent, who planned sabotage operations, or the brave souls who planted explosives on German supply trains. "I'm just the messenger," she would whisper to herself during long nights in that damp cellar. The real heroes are the ones with guns. Laurent had sensed her frustration and repeatedly reminded her how crucial her role was. "Celeste, your job is to stay alive and keep these radios working. Leave the fighting to us." But she always wondered the same thing. What if staying hidden isn't enough anymore? May 15, 1944, started like any other night. Celeste slipped into Margot's cellar at her usual time, settled behind the radio equipment, and began her routine of monitoring resistance frequencies. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with the kind of tension that made experienced operators nervous. But she attributed it to the approaching storm clouds she'd noticed during her walk to the bakery. At 11:47 p.m., everything changed. She was adjusting the frequency dial when she accidentally intercepted a German military transmission. This happened sometimes, and protocol was clear: note the frequency, then immediately switch to resistance channels. But something about the urgency in the German officer's voice made her pause. She'd been listening to German communications long enough to pick up basic military terminology, and what she heard made her blood freeze. 3 Panzer tanks. Moving towards Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. Departure time, 4:00 a.m. Estimated arrival, dawn. The German voice was methodical, almost bored, as he relayed coordinates and tactical positions. To him, this was just another routine operation. But Celeste understood exactly what those coordinates meant. The tanks would position themselves to control the 3 main roads leading out of the village, creating a perfect trap. No one would escape. Then came the part that stopped her heart entirely. The officer began reading names from a list. Henri Novak, Vivienne Novak, Margot Rousseau, Laurent Dubois. 12 names total, including her parents and the 2 people who'd become her closest allies in the resistance. The Germans had identified suspected resistance members and sympathizers, and tomorrow's operation wasn't just about controlling territory. It was about execution. Celeste's hands trembled as she frantically tried to reach Laurent on the resistance frequency. Static. She adjusted the antenna, checked the connections, tried different frequencies. Nothing but dead air. Laurent and his team were 20 miles north, conducting their own operation against a German supply convoy. Even if her radio was working perfectly, they were too far away to receive her transmission clearly, and definitely too far away to return before dawn. She tried reaching Allied command frequencies, but the radio equipment was acting erratically. The recent German bombing of a nearby town had damaged telephone lines and possibly affected radio transmission equipment in the entire region. Every frequency she tried either produced static or weak signals that wouldn't carry her message far enough to matter. By 1:30 a.m., she had to face the terrible reality. She was completely alone with information that could save or doom everyone she loved. The village had no anti-tank weapons. The local resistance cell consisted of Laurent and 3 other men, all currently 20 miles away. The village's only defense was a handful of hunting rifles and farming tools that would be useless against armored vehicles. Celeste sat in that damp cellar, staring at the useless radio equipment, and felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her. She could warn the villagers to hide, but German search techniques were thorough and brutal. They would find anyone attempting to conceal themselves in cellars, attics, or nearby woods. She could try to lead people away from the village, but the tanks would control all escape routes by dawn. For the first time in 8 months of resistance work, her steady hands wouldn't stop shaking. This was her worst nightmare made real. All those nights she'd wondered if staying hidden would be enough, if being just a radio operator would matter when it truly counted. Now she knew the answer. When the moment came that required more than listening and transmitting, she was powerless to protect the people she loved most. She thought about her brother Thomas, probably dead in some German prison camp because he'd tried to be a hero. She thought about her father Henri, who would die tomorrow morning never knowing his youngest daughter had tried desperately to save him. She thought about Margot sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware that her kindness in sheltering a young radio operator had signed her death warrant. The clock on the cellar wall read 2:15 a.m., less than 4 hours until the tanks departed their base. Less than 6 hours until they reached Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. Celeste pressed her face into her hands and whispered the question that had haunted her for months, now transformed from curiosity into desperate prayer. What happens when there's nobody else left to fight? At 2:30 a.m., sitting in that cold cellar with her useless radio equipment, Celeste made a decision that surprised even her. She wasn't going to let her family die without a fight. The idea came from an unexpected memory. 2 summers before the war, her brother Thomas had taken her exploring in the old mining tunnels that honeycombed the hills around Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. The village had been built on an old copper mining site, and generations of miners had carved an intricate network of passages beneath the surrounding countryside. "Look here, little sister," Thomas had said, pointing to where 3 tunnels converged near the surface. "These passages come up right where the old Roman roads cross. Any army trying to control our village would have to position their vehicles at exactly these spots." At the time, she'd thought it was just her brother showing off his knowledge of local history. Now, those tunnel exits represented the only tactical advantage she possessed. Celeste knew from intercepting German communications that Panzer tanks followed predictable positioning protocols. They would park at the 3 road junctions to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring no one could escape the village in any direction. What the German tank commanders didn't know was that they would be positioning their vehicles directly over tunnel exits that led to underground passages large enough for a person to crawl through. The plan forming, in her mind, was desperate, probably suicidal, but it was the only option that gave her family any chance of survival. She spent the next hour gathering supplies from Margot's storage room and the small cache of equipment the resistance kept hidden in the bakery's walls. Old mining explosives left over from before the war, originally intended for clearing tree stumps and creating irrigation ditches. Alarm clocks that could serve as crude timing devices, copper wire from her father's clock repair kit, candles for working in absolute darkness. The explosives were unstable after years of storage, but Celeste's experience with delicate electrical work served her well. Her hands, which had shaken uncontrollably an hour earlier, steadied as she focused on the technical challenge ahead. She carefully measured charges, tested wire connections, and rigged timing mechanisms using skills she'd learned from years of helping her father repair intricate clockwork. By 3:15 a.m., she was ready to attempt something no radio operator had ever been trained for. Crawling through those mining tunnels was the most terrifying experience of her young life. The passages were barely wide enough for her shoulders, often filled with knee-deep water that soaked through her clothes and made every movement treacherous. She had to carry the explosive charges in a waterproof satchel, knowing that one wrong move could collapse the tunnel and bury her alive. But as she crawled through that underground maze, something fundamental changed inside her. For 8 months, she'd defined herself by what she couldn't do. She couldn't fight like the men. She couldn't sabotage supply lines or assassinate German officers. She couldn't be a real hero like her brother Thomas. Tonight, she realized that heroism wasn't about matching someone else's idea of courage. It was about using whatever skills you possessed when people needed you most. Her steady hands, trained on delicate radio equipment, proved equally skilled at connecting detonator wires. Her patience, developed through long nights of monitoring static-filled frequencies, served her well during hours of careful preparation in cramped, flooded tunnels. Her technical knowledge, gained from helping her father repair clockwork mechanisms, allowed her to create timing devices that would synchronize 3 separate explosions. The first explosive placement took 45 minutes of careful work. The charge had to be positioned precisely beneath where a tank would park, with timing mechanisms calibrated to detonate at exactly the right moment. 1 tunnel down, 2 to go. As she crawled toward the second tunnel exit, Celeste found herself thinking about Laurent's words. "Leave the fighting to us." She finally understood that fighting didn't always look like charging across a battlefield with a rifle. Sometimes fighting meant a 19-year-old girl crawling through flooded tunnels with homemade explosives, using technical skills most people dismissed as unimportant. By 4:45 a.m., all 3 charges were in place. The German tanks would depart their base in 15 minutes. In less than 2 hours, her quiet village would become a battlefield, and she would discover whether steady hands and precise timing could accomplish what trained soldiers might not even attempt. "Come on, Celeste," she whispered as she checked the final connection. "You've never let a signal fail to transmit. Don't let these people down now." At 5:47 a.m., Celeste crouched in the central mining tunnel, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the German tank crews would hear it through 6 feet of earth and stone. Through a crack in the tunnel ceiling, she could see the first rays of sunlight filtering through the morning mist that always settled over Saint-Pierre-du-Mont at dawn. Then she heard them. The unmistakable rumble of tracked vehicles approaching from the east, exactly as the intercepted German transmission had indicated. The sound grew louder, closer, until the ground above her head vibrated with each revolution of steel tracks against cobblestone roads. The first Panzer positioned itself directly over her primary tunnel exit, just as she'd predicted. German tactical doctrine was nothing if not predictable. The tank commander was following his training perfectly, parking his 30-ton killing machine at the exact intersection that would give him optimal control over the village's main escape route. Celeste checked her improvised timing device one final time. The alarm clock showed 5:51 a.m. She had rigged the mechanism to trigger the detonator at 5:52, giving the tank crew just enough time to shut down their engine and begin their dismount procedures. Maximum personnel casualties, maximum equipment destruction. Her finger hovered over the activation switch she'd jury-rigged from radio components. One press would set all 3 timing devices in motion, and there would be no way to stop what happened next. At 5:52 exactly, she pressed the switch. The explosion was bigger than anything she'd imagined. The tunnel filled with dust and debris as the blast wave knocked her flat against the earthen wall. Above her head, she heard the distinctive sound of 30 tons of German steel flipping completely over, crushing the stone wall of the village's oldest building. Before the dust had even settled, the second tank tried to flank left toward the northern road. Celeste had anticipated this maneuver from her months of listening to German tactical communications. She triggered the second charge manually, watching through her tunnel crack as the explosion caught the Panzer at the perfect angle, sending it crashing sideways into Margot's neighbor's house. The third tank commander, now understanding that his unit was under coordinated attack, attempted to retreat toward the eastern road. But Celeste had spent 4 hours in these tunnels learning every possible escape route and attack angle. Her final explosive charge detonated just as the tank tried to reverse, lifting the rear of the vehicle completely off the ground and dropping it into the crater created by the blast. In less than 3 minutes, Celeste had accomplished what a full squad of trained anti-tank specialists might not have managed with proper equipment, but her victory celebration lasted exactly 15 seconds. German infantry emerged, From behind the wreckage of the first tank, at least 20 soldiers who had been following the armored vehicles on foot. They spread out in professional formation, searching for whoever had destroyed their armor support. One of them spotted the tunnel entrance where Celeste had been working and began shouting orders in German. She was trapped. The tunnel system had multiple exits, but German soldiers were already moving to surround the area. In a few minutes, they would either capture or kill her, and then they would take their frustration out on every villager they could find. That's when she heard the sound that changed everything. Allied aircraft engines approaching from the west. Not the high-altitude bombers that occasionally passed over the region, but low-flying fighters coming in fast and aggressive. The explosions from her makeshift mines had created a beacon visible for miles, drawing Allied planes that had been searching for targets of opportunity during their morning patrol. The timing was perfect, almost impossibly so. For 8 months, Celeste had been guiding Allied aircraft to strategic targets using radio transmissions and coded coordinates. Now, without any radio equipment at all, she had created the most effective target marker of her entire resistance career. The Allied fighters strafed the German infantry positions with devastating accuracy, drawn to the exact location by the smoke and debris from the tank explosions. The soldiers who had been closing in on her tunnel entrance scattered or fell under the surprise air attack. When the smoke finally cleared, Celeste climbed out of the tunnel system covered in mud, debris, and cordite residue. Margot found her first, standing in what had been the village's central intersection, now transformed into a crater surrounded by destroyed German equipment. Mon Dieu, Celeste, Margot gasped, staring at the destruction around them. What have you done? Celeste looked at the wreckage of 3 Panzer tanks, the scattered German equipment, and the intact buildings where her family and friends were now safe. For the first time in 8 months, she answered with complete confidence. I stopped being invisible. The village of Saint-Pierre-du-Mont was liberated 3 days later. Word of Celeste's single-handed destruction of 3 German tanks spread through resistance networks faster than radio transmissions ever could. Allied command had never heard of a radio operator using mining explosives and tunnel systems to eliminate armored vehicles, and they wanted to understand exactly how she'd accomplished something their trained demolition experts considered nearly impossible. But Celeste didn't stick around for the interviews or the medal ceremonies that everyone assumed would follow. The morning after her tank battle, she was back in Margot's cellar with her radio equipment, coordinating supply drops and troop movements as if nothing extraordinary had happened. When Laurent returned with his team and found the village intact instead of burned to the ground, he couldn't believe the reports. You destroyed 3 Panzers? He asked, staring at the craters that still marked the village's main intersection. I used the skills I had when people needed me to, Celeste replied, never taking her eyes off her radio dials. Same as always. That response perfectly captured who she remained for the rest of her life. The night of May 16, 1944 didn't transform Celeste into a different person. It revealed who she'd always been beneath the quiet exterior that fooled everyone, including herself. She continued operating radio equipment for the resistance until the war ended, but she never again doubted her own capabilities or dismissed her contributions as unimportant. The German retaliation force that was supposed to follow the tank attack never materialized. Allied intelligence later revealed that Celeste's improvised beacon had guided a major airstrike to a German supply depot 20 miles away, destroying fuel and ammunition reserves that crippled enemy operations throughout the region. Her single night of visible heroism had created invisible advantages that lasted for months. When the war ended, official records of that night's events remained classified for decades. The French government couldn't publicly acknowledge that untrained civilians had access to military explosives, and the Allies didn't want to encourage similar improvisations that might result in civilian casualties. Celeste received a Croix de Guerre in a private ceremony, attended only by Laurent and a single French colonel who sworn to secrecy about the details. She never spoke about her tank destroyer experience, not even to her family. Henri and Vivienne knew their daughter had been involved in resistance activities, but they assumed she'd simply helped with radio work like many young people during the occupation. When they asked about the craters in the village center, she told them Allied bombing had hit German positions, which was technically true. Celeste married a quiet man named Philippe who'd served as a medic during the liberation. They moved to a small town in Normandy where she worked as a librarian for 43 years. She had 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and became known throughout her community for her prize-winning roses and her legendary apple pies. People who knew her described her as gentle, soft-spoken, and someone who never tried to be the center of attention. The only hint of her wartime experience was her lifelong fascination with radio equipment. She maintained a ham radio setup in her basement and could often be found late at night, monitoring frequencies and talking to operators around the world. Her neighbors assumed it was just an unusual hobby for a retired librarian. She kept her wartime journal hidden in the false bottom of her jewelry box, along with the Croix de Guerre that had been presented 50 years late when classified documents were finally declassified. The final entry, dated May 17, 1944, read, "Today I learned that the most important battles aren't always fought by the people everyone expects to be heroes." When she told me this story on her deathbed, I understood why she'd waited so long to share it. Celeste had spent her entire life being underestimated, and she was comfortable with that invisibility because she knew the truth about her own strength. She didn't need recognition or praise to understand her worth. I spent my whole life thinking Grandma Celeste was the quiet one in our family. Turns out she was just saving her loudest moment for when it mattered most. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who spend their lives listening, waiting for that one moment when they need to be heard. The medal is now framed in my living room, next to a photo of her tending her roses. Every time I look at it, I remember that heroism isn't about the size of your voice or the boldness of your personality. Sometimes it's about a 19-year-old girl who destroyed 3 tanks before breakfast and then went back to work like nothing had happened.